We left off where Kazul was heading out to try to find the rest of the wizards because she has been released and they've melted most of the ones in the cave, but there are some outside. So Mendenbar is following her out as she tries to get some level of revenge. Chapter 17, in which Mendenbar grows some trees and makes a wicked suggestion. There were, however, no wizards outside the cave. There was only an enormous stretch of barren land that looked as if it had been burned. Morwen's long-haired tabby cat sat in the ashes several feet from the mouth of the cave, surveying the waste with evident disapproval. "There you are," Morwen said to the cat as she joined Cimmerian and Mendenbar by Kazul's left shoulder. "Any signs of more wizards?" The cat meowed. "Good," said Morwen. "Did any of the others get away?" The cat made a growling noise. "Very good," said Morwen. She turned to Mendenbar. "Can you keep them from interrupting us by accident?" "I don't think so," Mendenbar said. "There isn't any magic here for me to work with." He was horrified at the extent of the destruction. How was he going to fix it? "So this is how they did it," Telemain's voice said from behind Mendenbar. He sounded pleased, as if he had just solved a very difficult puzzle. "I'd been wondering." "Did what?" Mendenbar said. "Establish that shield spell," Telemain said. "The power involved was clearly several factors beyond the generating capacity of—" Kazul turned her head and looked at Telemain. Telemain coughed. "There weren't enough wizards to have done by themselves." "Power," Mendenbar said, half to himself. "They sucked all of the magic out of this whole area and put it into the shield. Where did it go when the shield disappeared?" "Where did it go when the shield disappeared?" "Into your sword, of course," said Telemain, as if that were so obvious that everyone should have realized it without him having to say anything. "And the sword is linked to the forest," Mendenbar said, "and this part of the forest, or it should be part, so all you have to do is use the sword to put the magic back where it belongs," Cimmerian finished. "Theoretically, that should work fine," Telemain said, "but the practical applications aren't always so easy." "Nonsense," said Cimmerian. "The sword turned a whole patch of mountains of morning into a bit of the enchanted forest when we were having all that trouble getting here. Mendenbar pulled it back into the sword then. All he has to do now is turn that spell around and push magic out. Try it, Mendenbar." Slowly, Mendenbar lowered the tip of the sword until it touched the ashes. He couldn't feel anything at first, and then he realized he was trying to reach outside of himself for the threads of magic that always floated around him in the enchanted forest. And in this wasteland, there were no threads. He frowned, closing his eyes. He concentrated on the sword instead. That felt more promising. He could sense the power crackling along the length of the blade. Lots of power. But he did not think that it would be enough. He stretched deeper, using his experience outside the enchanted forest to pull together every last bit of magic he could reach. And it was still not enough. "I don't think I can do it, Cimmerian." "You can too," Cimmerian said, and put her hand on his shoulder. "Try again." As she touched his shoulder, Mendenbar felt it come. Not just magic, not only power, but all the magic and power of the enchanted forest itself. It washed over him, and as it did, he saw patterns in it. Patterns that were the threads he manipulated to work magic in the forest. And he saw how to shift the pattern just a little, filling it in with the power that was stolen from the forest and stored in the sword, so that he could repair the damage the wizards had done. And without thinking, he did it. He heard an astonished gasp from Cimmerian, a snort from Kazul, and a low whistle from Telemain, as well as a surprise noise from one of the cats. "Well," said Morwen. Mendenbar opened his eyes. A thick carpet of moss, greener than Kazul's scales, spread out in all directions from the cave mouth. Massive oaks and beeches with copper leaves stood so close together that it was hard to see little more than a little way into the shadows below them. packing every part of what had been burned out waste moments before. All around Mendembar could feel the threads of magic hovering in the air, ready to use for more ordinary spells. No one said anything for a long moment, and then Telemaine tore his gaze away from the restored forest and turned to Mendembar. "Could you do that again, slowly, so I could analyze it?" he asked. Despite Telemaine's urging, Mendembar refused to repeat the spell immediately, though he did offer to let the magician watch when he went to clean up the barren area near the green glass pool. Then Telemaine wanted to stay and investigate the melted wizard some more, but Morwen and Cimmerian insisted that this was a bad idea, and eventually he gave in. He was inclined to be sulky about it, until Morwen pointed out that he had 14 more wizard staffs to study, including one that had belonged to the head wizard of the Society of Wizards. It cheered him up enormously. "You're quite right," he told Morwen. "Those wizards will get themselves back together before long, and once they do, they'll come looking for their staffs. If I don't examine the staffs before then, I'll lose my chance. I can always melt another wizard later and study the disintegration process then." He hurried back to the cave, reappearing a moment later with his arms full of wizard staffs. "Be careful with those," Mendembar said as Telemaine came out onto the moss-covered ground. "They're unlikely to be a source of difficulty without intelligent guidance," Telemaine said reprovingly. "So long as the wizards are not in contact with them, they should be merely passive instruments of assimilation. There's nothing to worry about." "Yes, there is," Cimmerian put in. "If you drop them, Mendembar will have a lot of ugly brown marks on his nice new moss. And if they can do that, there's no telling what else they can do." "Wizards store spells in their staffs," Morwen said, nodding. "You can't always be sure what will set one off." Telemaine looked at them with annoyance. "I suppose you'd rather I left them here? Have you no spirit for scientific investigation?" "Not where wizards are concerned," Cimmerian muttered. "Nonsense," they said. "I'm just as curious as you are, Telemaine," Morwen added. "But I never heard that a spirit of scientific inquiry precluded taking intelligent precautions." "Oh, I see," said Telemaine. "Why didn't you just say so in the first place?" While the others talked, Mendembar studied the staffs, keeping a careful watch on the threads of the enchanted forest that were nearest to Telemaine. To his surprise, the threads showed no tendency to drift towards the magician or wind themselves into knots around the staffs that he carried. Apparently, Telemaine was right. The staffs would only be a minor nuisance, as long as their wizards weren't carrying them. He resolved to mention this to Telemaine later. Perhaps Telemaine could even help him find a way to deal with the problems the staff had caused when they did have wizards with them. A few minutes later, when Kazul was satisfied that there were no wizards left in the area, Mendembar took them all back to the castle with a swift spell. He was relieved that the wizard staffs caused no trouble, and pleased to discover that transporting a dragon was no harder than transporting anyone else. They materialized in the castle courtyard, just inside the moat. Willin, who had apparently been watching for their arrival, came hurrying out to meet them. "Welcome home, Your Majesty," the elf said with evident relief. Mendembar noticed that he dug up a formal uniform somewhere, all sky blue velvet and dusty gold braid. "May I assume that your mission was a success?" "Yes, you may," Mendembar said. "Willin, this is Kazul, king of the dragons, and she's very hungry. See if you can scare up something in the kitchen that would be dragon-sized." "At once, Your Majesty," Willin said, bowing. "And may I congratulate you and your companions on your great achievement and welcome King Kazul to the Enchanted Forest." "The welcome I'm interested in is dinner," Kazul said with a smile that showed all of her teeth. Willin backed away hastily. Of course, I'll see about it immediately." "I'd better come with you," said Cimmerian. "I've been Kazul's chief cook for over a year, and I know what she likes." The two of them left, heading for the other side of the castle, with Kazul trailing hopefully behind them. Mendembar wasn't sure whether to be disappointed or relieved. He wanted very much to talk to Cimmerian, but he wasn't sure how to tell her what he wanted to say. And anyway, they certainly wouldn't discuss the things he wanted to talk about with all these people around. Mendenbar, have you got somewhere I could work without these being disturbed? Telemain asked, nodding at the load of wizard staffs he was carrying. I wouldn't mind examining them myself, Morrowind said. The blue room would be best, I think, Mendenbar said. The light is better in my study, but there's a gargoyle in the corner who can be difficult. We'll take the study, Morrowind said decisively. Light is important, and once Telemain gets involved, he won't notice any distractions. What about you? Telemain asked, nettled. Morrowind sniffed. I can handle considerably more than a mere gargoyle. All right, Mendenbar said, as long as you're sure. He showed them to the study and helped them get settled, then went down to the kitchen to see how Cimmerian and Kazul were doing. He found Kazul in the rear courtyard eating an enormous kettle of stew that had been intended for supper for the entire castle. Yes. Awesome. Cimmerian was in the kitchen, her arms covered with flour to the elbows, rolling out pie crust and giving orders to the cook. Mendenbar stayed long enough to make sure the cook would do whatever Cimmerian told him, and then Cimmerian chased him away, saying that it was difficult enough to cook in a strange kitchen without people hovering over her. You don't have to cook anything, Mendenbar told her. I do if we want to eat dinner, Cimmerian retorted. Kazul is already eating everything that was ready for tonight, and she's going to want more as soon as she's finished. Here people aren't prepared to cope with a visiting dragon. We've never had one before. Well, you have one now. Cimmerian glanced toward the courtyard and lowered her voice. I think we'll stay for a few days at least, if that won't cause too many problems. Kazul needs to get her strength back before she tries to fly to the Mountains of Morning. You can stay here as long as you like, Mendenbar assured her. Is there anything I can do to help? You can let me get back to making dinner, Cimmerian said. She was smiling, but she obviously meant what she said. All right, call me if you need anything. Mendenbar bowed and left, feeling a little put out. He went to the castle library since his study was occupied, and poked around in the scrolls for a few minutes. Then he decided to check on Prince Rupert and his nephew. He found the middle-aged prince quickly enough, but he had to send someone to retrieve the young crown prince from the dungeon. Did you enjoy your stay? Mendenbar asked when Crown Prince Jerillim arrived at last. It was all right, Jerillim said. He looked rumpled and vaguely dissatisfied, but there weren't any rats. I thought there'd be rats. There wasn't a rat either. Jerillim, Prince Rupert said sharply, it's not polite to complain about things like that. Where are your manners? I don't understand, Jerillim said, frowning. If there were rats and a rack, I'd be expected to object, wouldn't I? So why can't I complain when there aren't any? It's just not the same thing, Rupert told him. I'm sorry, Your Majesty, he went on, turning to Mendenbar. He's so used to getting his own way. I'm afraid I haven't done a very good job teaching him how to behave. I behave just fine, Jerillim said. I'm beginning to understand why you wanted to abandon him in the enchanted forest, Mendenbar said to Rupert. Rupert flushed. No, it's not that. I'm really very fond of the boy, but I have an obligation, you know, and there's no getting out of it. You can leave me here, Uncle, Jerillim said persuasively. That's abandoning me in the enchanted forest, isn't it? I don't think so, Mendenbar put in quickly. He didn't want to think about the problems that the Crown Prince could cause if he stayed at the castle. There are too many people here for it to count as abandonment. Prince Rupert nodded gloomily. I'm afraid you're right, and frankly, I'm not at all sure that abandoning him is the right notion. I just can't think of anything else wicked to do on such short notice. But you promised you'd abandon me in the enchanted forest, Jerillim protested, and I want to be abandoned and have all sorts of adventures and come home covered in glory. You're a little young for that, Mendenbar commented, studying the Crown Prince. He smiled, suddenly, as an idea came to him. What you need is proper training. What do you think he's thinking of? What you need is some proper training. There isn't time, Jerillim said smugly. Uncle has to do something wicked to me right away. Ah, but that's the point, Mendenbar said. He turned to Prince Rupert, ignoring Jerillim's suddenly wary expression. Abandoning Crown Prince Jerillim won't do you any good because he wants to be abandoned. Letting him have his own way isn't terribly wicked, even if it's not good for him. I'm afraid you're right, Rupert said sadly. But Uncle, On the other hand, Mendenbar went on, disregarding Jerillem's interjection, if you promise to abandon him, breaking that promise would certainly be wicked. And if you send him off to a private school for princes, I don't want to go to school. Oh my. Rupert looked from Mendenbar to Jerillem, who looked thoroughly alarmed, and then looked back. I see what you're getting at. If he hates the idea, then it probably is wicked, even if it's good for him. And there's breaking the promise, too. And you wouldn't have to tell anyone at home what you'd done with him, Mendenbar said. You could rule the country just as if you really had abandoned him in the forest, and no one would know. Surely misleading all those people would be wicked enough for your society. I think you're right, Prince Rupert said, smiling for the first time since Mendenbar had met him. I really think you're right. His face fell suddenly. But how am I going to find a good school for him before sunset tomorrow? Don't worry about that, Mendenbar said reassuringly. I know just the place. It's up in the mountains of Morning, where no one is likely to run across it, and it's run by a dwarf named Herman. If you like, I'll send a message off right away to arrange things. No, said Jerillem. That would be wonderful, said Prince Rupert in relief. I don't suppose this Herman person would be willing to write a letter to the society explaining matters? I don't see why not, Mendenbar said. But what do you want it for? Just to confirm that I'm fulfilling the requirements, Prince Rupert explained. It is a rather unusual arrangement, you see, and I want to be sure that the society will think I've been wicked enough. I understand, Mendenbar told him. Don't worry about it. If Herman won't write you a negative enough letter, I'll send one myself. I'll bet even the Right Honorable Wicked Stepmother's Traveling, Drinking, and Debating Society will believe the king of the Enchanted Forest.